Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Today's session is going to be a little bit about the demo, about how to make bars, spies, and lines in scatterplot. But we all know how to make these basic plots in Excel. Today, I'll be delving into a little more of Flourish Studio, how we can make our graphs a little more aesthetically pleasing. We know that when it comes to a lot of medical data, it is boring, it is consistent, there's not a lot of color play in it, but there are different ways also that we can make our plots look a little better. So just a brief recap of what Sir taught us last week. We know that there are different types of data visualization. We usually do this data visualization for either showing relationship between two variables, trying to understand the distribution between the data, try to compare between the data sets or understand the composition of our entire data. So when it comes to showing relationship between two variables, we tend to use two types of plots, which is a scatter plot and a bubble chart. The scatter plot, we use two variables, that is x-axis and y-axis. We use two variables to show the relationship between them. Whereas in a bubble chart, as explained by Sir last week, we not just have our x-axis and our y-axis, but we also have the size of our bubble that tells us a particular relationship there. Moving on, we have charts that show us comparison between two individual points in our data set, which is best shown using bar graphs or line charts. Bar graphs are one of the most basic charts that we prepare using our data set, and line charts are usually used to show the changes over a period of time. Going on, we talk about distribution. When we talk about distribution, the first thing that comes into our mind is histograms. Histogram shows us the distribution of our data set. It gives us a shaped curve. It can be either bell shaped, it can be skewered, but it depends on our data. The histogram, usually we can understand our mean and standard deviation that is present in our data. When we are studying box plots or violin plots, it tells us more about the median values and the outliers also that are present in our data. And it also gives us a better visualization of how our data set looks like. Lastly, we have something known as the charts that show us the composition of our data set. So we use the most common chart that is used for showing the composition of our data set is our pie diagram, or we use stacked bars, or we used line plots that can be converted into area plots that can show us the composition of our data. So today we'll be moving on to more of the demo part than the presentation. If anybody has their laptops and wants to try on with the data set, please go ahead and open up your laptops and try with the data. So today over here, we have a general data set that includes demographic data with respect to patients suffering with chronic pancreatitis, and we have data with respect to the healthy controls. Now, we all know that when we make graphs, we look at what data are we supposed to use to make a particular graph. Now, let's start with a simple bar graph. If you have a demographic data set of a patient, what data would you use to prepare a bar graph? What would you try to understand using a? You have different categories over here saying the etiology of the patient, or you have let's say over here you have the disease status, that the depression status of the patient, or you can use the education group, whether you want to show these particular variables in a bar graph. How are you going to show it? For our Excel sheets, it's very simple. We know that we take up our data and we select our data, We go into the charts, and we get our custom made etiology, but it looks very boring. If you see this graph, you can very clearly see that the data is spread across the entire plot, but you're not able to understand your data over here. What are you understanding in this data? You can see you have alcohol and smoking, you have idiopathic, you have smoking and tobacco. But do you understand what percentage of the patients have the idiopathic, or what percentage of the patients are alcohol consuming? Do you understand anything out of this data set? You don't. So there are better ways to visualize this particular data set. Now in Excel itself, what you can do is you can try to edit your data. When you select the bar graph over here, and you go into design, you can change the colors of the bar graph, or you can try to understand, you can add error bars. You can add access titles, you can remove or add error bars. You can do a lot of variations in this, but uh, it still looks very simple and bland. Now, with this type of data, you cannot understand whether idiopathic is more or alcohol is more or what is more. So we try to understand this using Flourish Studio. So Flourish Studio is basically a free software that is available online. You can register using your Google ID. So what we try to understand over here is how we can represent this simple data, but in an aesthetic manner, in a manner where people can understand, okay, so in disease group, in the disease group also, we have patients that have diabetes, patients that do not have diabetes. We try to differentiate between the etiology amongst the groups. It'll be really helpful if you guys have your laptops on with you, and you can go into Flourish and first register yourself. So once you register, you come into something like this. When you see Flourish Studio, it'll give you a variety of options that you can choose from. You have various types of line, bar, and pie charts over here. And most of the representations over here are free. So you can use them. You don't need to sign up. You don't need to pay anything to use these type of charts. You'd not just have your bar diagrams and pie charts, but you also have a lot of area distribution. So if you're wanting to show your patient data, and you want to show where your patients have come from, or you want to show a distribution of where they how many patients are from. Suppose you say in AIG itself, you see a lot of patients are coming from the northeastern side. You have a couple that are coming from Maharashtra. You have some in Telangana itself. So you can show that distribution over here using these particular charts. Then the next one is the scatter plots. You have a lot of variations to which type of scatter plot you can use. Last, we have our basic scatter plot that shows relationship between the two variables. And you also have your bubble charts that can show relationship between three variables. Apart from that, if you've seen these animated bar graphs where you can see that they're showing the race between 4 or 5 individual samples, where this is a very basic example. Suppose now we're seeing the World Cup, right? We see there are various teams. Now we don't know if we just put them in a table and say that India is on the top, and then there's Australia, and then there's some other team. You won't understand it easier that way. But if you show it in a bar graph where you can show how the team is progressing over a period of time, and you show it in an animated way, you can make all of those charts also using Flourish over here. So there are varieties of charts that you can make using Flourish, and that is something that you'll have to go in further and understand. So today, let's just make a simple bar chart. So as soon as I click a column chart, this is what I'm coming across. So every time Flourish, when you go into it, it'll give you an example data set, which makes it easier for you to understand. So there are two tabs over here. One is the preview tab and the other is the data tab. So what we're going to do today here is, now I want to put my etiology over here. And I get the numbers over here. So I'm going to paste it over here. You can see that in the corner over here, you can get a visualization as you're adding the data. You can see whether you're going wrong when you're adding the data or not. And then you go into preview. It gives you the same type of a graph that is there in Excel. But here's the fun. This is where you start changing the graphs. So over here, we have an option. We have various controls over here on the right hand side. So I'm going to go into chart type and I'm going to select value. Now what this is going to do is it's going to arrange my entire data set based on the values. So now when you see it, you immediately understand that idiopathic was the highest amount of patients that were there, which is followed by alcohol, smoking, and tobacco is the least. So this makes our chart more visually appealing. I can go into colors and I can change the colors. Now here you can see the colors are changing single-handedly. Even in Excel, the color changes for the entire data set. But in Flourish, we can change it according to the rows also. So we can change it based on whatever we want to try. So now I want to, suppose in my data set, in my paper, I just want to show a comparison between alcoholics and idiopathic. What am I supposed to do here? So we have this edit color palette option. I will try to change the colors over here, and whatever is not required, I try to put them into grayscale. So when I do this, and you can see the chart clearly, I'm able to represent this in a better manner, saying that there is a lot of comparison between alcoholics and idiopathic, but the highest amount of patients that are present here are idiopathic. Apart from that, you can also try to play between the size of your graph, the bar, the spacing between the bars. These are all options that are not available in Excel, but these are some things that you can change. The opacity of our graph, whether we want it to be opaque or whether we want it to be transparent, we can change that. We can add labels again. Now, if I want to add the numbers or the percentages, in Excel, we don't have a lot of options. Again, it is very limited. It either comes on the top of the bar or in the center. But over here, we can again change it and place it wherever we want. We can change the size of our labeling. When it comes to the axis, I can flip the axis. I can make the highest first or vice versa. Whichever way I want to represent, I can change the axis. I can add the axis title if I want, saying no. Okay, wait. Theology. I can change the color here. I can add even my lines, whether I want grid lines in my graph or not. I can change it. Usually, as sir mentioned last week also, grid lines are something that block our background. They don't help us understand our graphs better. So we usually do not add grid lines to our graphs either. So this is something that we can play with. Again, in y-axis, I do not want my grid lines. So there, I can switch my grid lines off and I can just suppose now my data is in percentage and not the number of people. But over here, when we add the data, we don't get to add the suffix that is percentage. Where am I supposed to add it? I want to represent that on my graph. How am I supposed to show it? So we have options for that also. where you go into number formatting and you have either a prefix addition or a suffix addition, and you can add a suffix over here saying percentage. And automatically you can see that the percentage is added on the labels. Now, when it comes to legends, do I want the legends or do I not want the legends is a choice. Usually it is very cluttered. Already you can see that the labels for the particular graphs is given below. So adding a label, again, adding a legend over there is a waste of time and space. It looks very cluttered. So you try to get rid of your legends. Again. You can add a title to my graph. Now I can speak about etiology. And I can add a title to my graph. What I can do is, if I don't like the colors over here again, I'll just change it. I want everything colored. So this is my graph. You can see it very clearly. It looks much better than whatever this was on Excel over here. But how do I get it onto my presentation? How do I add it to my PPT? What am I supposed to do? So there are 2 or 3 ways that we can do this. First is you go into export, which is in the right hand corner, and you download it as an image. Usually we try JPEG or SVG and we download it as an image. But what if I want a preview? I want it to be animated. I want my presentation to be a little more animated. I want my graphs to move like this when they come up on the screen. What am I supposed to do? So this is the animation that I'm looking for. So when I go into my presentation, I want that, at least in this particular thing, I want the animation to come up. So when we go into our presentation over here, we have something called as web viewer in our add-ons. That is something we can use. But sometimes it's not compatible. So what I suggest is every laptop now has a screen recording device. Basically, you can record your own screen. So you record your screen and you select as add in a video into your PPT and you add it to your presentation. It's going to look something like this. Now, this is one of my data sets that I presented, and I wanted to add my demographic data, but I wanted to make it look a little more aesthetic. What was I supposed to do? So I took a video and I added it like this into my presentation. Now it's the same data. It is demographic data. You can't make it more interesting. You are presenting what is present there, but you just try to make it look a little more aesthetic. This is what you do. Now, when it comes to bar graphs, I can change the chart type. Now, I don't want a vertical bar. I want an horizontal bar. How am I supposed to change it? So the first very option over here is called as chart type. And it helps me change my axis over here. I can change this into a pie chart also if I want. So I don't need to go back and change the entire thing and put in the entire data set all over again just because I want to change the visualization. I can just go here in chart type and I can try to change it. Now, the next view of representation is a pie diagram or a pie chart. Now, this chart is known as a donut chart for obvious because it has a hole in the middle. But what if you want a regular pie chart? So again, your controls over here change according to your graph that you have selected. So over here, now since I selected a pie chart, I get something called as segments. So I can increase the space between, I can decrease the space in between. I can just make it 0 and look like a regular pie chart. I can create spaces between each panels over here to make it look a little more separate so that you can understand your data better. You can do n number of things when it comes to representation. You just need to understand which data would look better in which type of representation. So we know that individual items like, suppose if I am supposed to take gender, in my presentation over here, I have spoken about gender distribution. I knew that genders are only 2, male or female, obviously for now. So it's easier to represent that in a pie chart. I cannot use a pie chart if I have 6 or 7 different blocks. Now the pie chart looks very cluttered. So I need to know that in such cases, I should choose something else. So I would choose for etiology, instead of a pie chart, I chose a bar diagram. Now things get a little different when you're trying to understand scatter plots and line plots. Before I go on to that, let's try looking at stacked bars. Now I want to show the data of the healthy controls and the patients in one diagram. The best representation is a stacked bar, basically. So how would you do that? You have, it's a very similar way. You go into the visualization over here, new visualization, and you select what is known as the stack bar. Flourish is not that difficult. It is as simple as Excel, so you shouldn't get scared while using something like this. All you need to do is just add your data in and try to play with the aesthetics that are present on the side of your screen. Similarly, when it comes to line charts, you should know that what type of data are you supposed to use for line charts. So if you're working with mice models, or if you're working with patients, now when it comes to patients, you have suppose you have to go back to them. You have follow-ups with patients. The patient comes on day 0, you take their data on day 0. Then the patient comes back after 3 months, you take the same data after 3 months, then 6 months, then over a year. So you span them over the entire year, but you want to represent that entire data. How do you represent it? You use something known as the line graph. So each point or each year will become your data point. So for each patient, you will have one line. Suppose you're trying to score between the pain that the patient experienced at day 0 and the pain that the patient experienced at, say, 365 days, after a year. And you have follow-ups every 3 to 6 months, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, and 12. So your time points will become 3, 6, 9, 12. And your y-axis becomes their pain score of how much the person is expecting the pain. And you try to track accordingly how much pain the patient has had over the years, and you add your points into this particular data set over here, and you preview. That's basic as much as it can be. Similarly, when it comes to scatter plots, it's the same visualization that you do. Now in scatter plots, we try to understand the relationship between two variables. So suppose you're trying to understand suppose you do some basic lab work. You try to understand the random blood sugar levels with their endotoxin levels. How would you try to understand? Again, in Excel, it's very simple. You just select your data, you go insert, and you say you want a scatter plot. It looks like this. But what if I want it to look a little more aesthetic? I put the same data into Flourish, and I try to play with the controls on the side. So here, now I can change the color of the dots according to what I want. I can change the color. I can add labels to the dots if I want. But again, the labels will be very shabby onto the chart, so I won't add labels. I can play with the axis. I can add trend lines if I want to. If I want a trend line, I can add a trend line to it. And this is how I try to make my charts look a little more better. This is most of what you're going to learn today. That's it. Thank you. If you guys have any doubts in using Flourish, or you want to, Flourish is basically something that you need to explore. I can only give you a data set and say that this is something that you're supposed to do or this is something you can play with. But when you add in your own data and you understand your data better, that's how you can do it. So Flourish is something that you can use for better visualizing. Thank you. If you guys have any